Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today is a special program. It is an open-ended conversation with my good friend James Tunney. This will, in fact, be my 30th interview with James and a good chance for us to tie up loose ends and probe deeper into the many topics that we've covered up until now. James is the author of many books, including The Mystical Accord, Sutras to Suit Our Times, Lines for Spiritual Evolution, The Mystery of the Trapped Light, Mystical Thoughts in the Dark Age of Scientism, 2 dystopian novels, Ireland, I Don't Recognize Who She Is, and Blue Lies September, as well as a number of books warning about the dangers of scientism, including Empire of Scientism, the dispiriting conspiracy and inevitable tyranny of Scientocracy, Tech Bondage, Slavery of the Human Spirit, and Human Entrance to Transhumanism, Machine Merger, and the End of Humanity. James lives in Gothenburg, Sweden, and now I'll connect to the internet video. Welcome, James. This is our 30th interview, so we've had many hours of discussion up until now, and I'm delighted to be with you once again.
Well, it's always lovely to hear your voice, Jeff, and I hope you haven't been saving up the hardest questions for today.
Well, in a way I have, because I think there's some unresolved issues, in particular from our last interview on the Fatima prophecies, that I think you sort of ventured into some new territory there, and sometimes in our discussions, you have a tendency to talk for maybe 10 minutes at a time. And during that 10-minute period, I might have 5 or 6 questions, but by the time you pause, I can only ask one of them.
I plead guilty, Your Honor.
So the advantage of today is we don't have a set time limit. I don't know how long we'll go, but it could be for as long as 3 hours or so. And that'll give us plenty of time to explore any nuances that we haven't had a chance to uncover up until now.
Yeah, well, let's hope we're still friends at the end of it.
You know, to be honest, even though I haven't seen you here in Albuquerque for years, it's been over 2 years since you visited in person, I consider you one of my close friends.
And likewise, Jeffrey, I'm very, very honored for that, and I've been very rich friendship and communication, so I really appreciate that, and I have great respect for your work and for you as a person, which is separate but related.
And I don't know if I've acknowledged this publicly on New Thinking Aloud, but you were of special help to me while I was working last year on my essay for the Bigelow Institute competition. And I think that the pointers that you gave me along the way made a real difference in the quality of the final essay I turned in.
Well, that's very, very kind of you to say. I'm sure it was just a pinch of salt to add to your work, so I appreciate that and accept that. That's kind of you to say so.
I guess maybe a good place to begin with is the fact that your background is really, your main background is in the field of law, even though I think of you as sort of a Renaissance man. You're a visual artist and a poet and a novelist, so you've done many things, but primarily as I look at your life, you've been a barrister and a professor of law.
Yeah, my main legal career was as a senior lecturer I started off and I studied in Trinity, and then I qualified as a barrister. And then I wanted to study some more, because at that stage in Ireland, the areas of law I was interested in were not very well developed. The practice wasn't very well developed. I became particularly interested in international commercial law, subjects like intellectual property. I became interested in intellectual property because I had an idea for a patent when I was younger, and I explored that. And they said there was a kind of patent advisory service, and it was meant to be a technical service, and they said that the solution was an obvious solution, and it wasn't a non-obvious solution. So I got preoccupied with those notions, and I began to talk to people. There was an Irish professor, I think, whose name was Tunney, who developed an armoured car, for example. And I remember asking him about where he got his intellectual property advice. And it wasn't very well developed. So that led me to London and to study intellectual property and communications, technology law, antitrust law, because in London you can attend the different colleges, UCL and Queen Mary, and you get access to some of the greatest scholars on a world level there. So I realized that there was a shift in my lifetime from the national to the transnational. And I was following these themes about how the world was organized. So subsequently, I decided to go into academia, and the way I was using my legal qualification, apart from the professorial side or the teaching side, was in engagement in international organizations. I was a member of organizations such as the International Federation of Travel and Tourism Advocates, for example, and who concentrate on travel and tourism law. A lot of people say, well, what's travel and tourism law? They're areas they're not very familiar with. I was involved in associations with international antitrust law, for example. So they're all areas about the evolution of transnational and corporate commercial law, and other areas like Aboriginal rights, which is really an area of that domain as well. So I tried to follow my interest and to use that. So when I was teaching law, for example, or working as a consultant in some organizations, I was trying to evolve my ideas, and I was also working in different contexts in business schools. I also worked in school of management or business, and I lectured part-time in a school of international relations. So I always sought to go beyond the narrow boundaries, and the premise for that it goes back to people like Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said that if your road is to law, well, it must take you through sociology and anthropology and all the other disciplines around it. And so I used to present outside my discipline. I used to present in social science, political science, whatever, and to try and understand where the subject fit into other subjects and what the discourse in those areas was or were.
On the surface, it would seem that all of those interests are almost antithetical to the interests that you have cultivated in mysticism.
That's a good point. I was always struck by this division, and I recognized it in myself before I began to read people like McGilchrist, and his book on the matter of with things, for example, is a fantastic work about the left brain and the right brain. It's really a remarkable work of our time. But I was aware of that in myself. I was aware that I was very good at, in my view, at analytical things, but I was also good at creative things. But often they don't go together. And I'd always been interested in spirituality, and I got more space. Space was the key issue. So as those explorations continued, and when I came around to write the Mystical Accord, the barb in the center, the force which was against spiritual evolution, came to be identified to me as that over concentration on technology, the dangers associated with technology. So I had posited, I came to the conclusion that the start of the journey was an insight, if you like, of that there had been a certain failure of spiritual evolution. That became very, very clear to me in a way as it was presented to me, that idea, and I reflected on that, and I wrote the Mystical Accord, and I triangulated it. I went back to materials, and I went back to looking for, to triangulate what I had intuitively come up with, which obviously involved some stuff I had looked at 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but again, a lot of, I thought, original stuff. And so the mystical base didn't get away from these big issues. So the point was that the spiritual journey is now coming up against these major macro forces. So no individual now really can escape from these macro forces. Even if we go and live in a cave somewhere, we might be able to exist for a period of time, but increasingly we won't be able to run away from this global communications culture. So it's inescapable. So I think so that's where they met, and the issues that I'm interested in now is concentrating on spiritual evolution and promoting the idea of spiritual evolution and the idea of spiritual consciousness, and trying to alert people to the dystopian future that can happen if we're not careful.
One thing we've never really talked about, other than the fact that you grew up in a Catholic family, is your own spiritual practice. Were you engaged in any forms of meditation or other comparable practices?
Well, I came from traditional Irish Catholic, so and all that entails. And I know the argument is to identify all the negative aspects, but that having been said, there's enough there about spirituality and the history that one can take the good with the bad, if you like. So there was that was there. Although I became very critical as I was growing up of the institutions. That didn't take away from a long history, and a long history as well of where Catholicism was related to a culture which is independent of the institution. A lot of people don't understand, for example, if you go back, that the discrimination, say, for example, against religious groups, Jews and Catholics and Presbyterians at certain stages, it was about a broader identity, so you couldn't help being identified with a particular group. So all that stuff is in the background. So there's other dimensions to the Catholicism in Ireland. As well as that, there was a very strong current, in my view, of connection with the pre-Christian Ireland. So I did when I was young get permission to be in Newgrange, for example, to witness the sun and the 21st of December, which was a great experience because I was interested in those things. I was interested in the Irish landscape. I was fascinated with how to interpret the landscape. There's an art in interpreting landscapes such as in Ireland. For example, when I'm going around Sweden, I can see things that I know are archaeological things that people don't notice because I've been looking at them all over Europe, and I can see the patterns of the culture that spread from all along the west coast of Europe and back to the Middle East, really. So you can see the remains. So that pre-Christian element was very much there. At the same time, Ireland was opening up to the world a bit. So I remember very, very clearly when my older sister, she used to come home with books. We all went to walked 8 miles to the library and got books. But I remember bringing home a book on yoga, and as soon as I saw it, I kind of recognized it as very familiar and correct in a way. I could identify with it. I could, that's. I hadn't known anything about yoga at the time. It wasn't as familiar, and I identified it immediately or felt a bond with it. It made sense to me. So I was always open to those influences. And later I became very interested in Taoism. And in that context, of course, and this is where there is cultural influence from places like California, you're coming back to sources which have their root, for example, in California, or that those great books that emerged from there. But as I've said before, there were elements in the Irish culture which had an affinity from the colonial context, for example, to India. And I was open to all those things. I never saw them as inconsistent. I never liked that dogmatism that you get in religion, that you can't look at the great forces and the great contributions from other cultures. So I felt very, very, very open to those, and to Jewish history, and I was very interested in and I think it's a very important part of our history, our entire history, to learn about that. So I was open to different ways of seeing things, and to try and develop a way of looking at that accommodates different perspectives.
I have the impression from this conversation that if I had to categorize your spiritual approach, I would say there's a large intellectual component. Some people might call that jnana yoga. You're so well read in so many different fields, and you have a way of tying them all back to the spiritual quest. On the other hand, what I don't get from this is that you've ever, been a deep practitioner of yoga or meditation, going off for a year or two to live in an ashram, for example, or becoming a part of a spiritual community that had a very intense practice.
No, I did attend various Buddhist communities here and there, or have gone to Christian monasteries here and there. But the community bit is not important, is not as important to me, and I'm a bit cautious about those things. And also, there is so much that one can explore on one's own, which is important for me, and certain neglected practices. For example, if you look at, there's a lot of interest in Wim Hof now, and people are aware of the Wim Hof method. But I remember studying that a long time ago, and studying it from its Oriental and even its history in Ireland and in other places. It wasn't a strange practice that people sought heat or cold. And I used to engage in cold water swimming, for example, when I could do. I swam all year round here for the first time this year. So I was out swimming in December and January when it was -10, etc. But that was a continuation of something that I had started previously. And people see these things as modern, but the disciplines are there. And then even when you come to things like pre-Christian Irish culture, well, there isn't a certainly valid practices associated with them, because they've been discarded, they've been lost. People don't want them. There was a shift in my lifetime towards scientism and the scientific worldview, not really interested in these things, desiring to be more modern. So if you said, well, I want to go and be a druid, well, actually, that practice, you can take there are certain streams, but in relation to the authenticity, you'd have to be very careful. That having been said, there were a lot of people in Ireland, a lot of older people that were very in touch with their spiritual identity. So it wasn't an alien concept. It wasn't a learned practice. It wasn't a discipline. It was a reality. So for a lot of the older people, for me, they had a deep spirituality which combined elements of Catholicism with something which was older, in a syncretic way, perhaps, and there was a synthesizing element in it, but it was a lived experience. So it wasn't something that you learned from a book. And when they talked about issues like faith and that, it wasn't anything theological or anything that you argue over. There was no discussions about these issues. It was a very, very deep connection with the land, with place, with other things. So there was a non-intellectual type. So I think that was always there. And it only became clear to me afterwards that people didn't have that they didn't have that off the ground, if you like, and it's become more pronounced recently when young people a generation has been subject to an assault by scientism, which saying that you're just a selfish gene, you're just this, you're that, and there has been that consistent dispiriting. So I think there was a bonus, if you like, that still existed in the end of a community that had a connection with the land for hundreds and thousands of years in a particular place. So in relation to disciplines, when we've talked before about doing little bits of martial arts or things, I was very aware of breathing is very, very important, and I took that very seriously. So I would take it from different places. Breathing is of the essence of all of these practices. So one has to get that right in whatever way that works for them. And associated with that, I thought it was it's very, very necessary for every individual to know how they can relax, especially in difficult circumstances. A lot of relaxation techniques are about kind of general accommodation to the world in some senses, but you have to be able to know when to relax or how to relax in difficult situations. So I did seek to perfect and to develop and to pick up from wherever I could techniques which were important for me in relation to my journey. That I didn't seek to unless people were interested, I didn't seek to project them, or I didn't seek to learn it off other people. And sometimes there is a point, I do find sometimes that people can get overly earnest about these things, that they get so serious about the technique that it doesn't sound authentic in some senses. And there's a certain type of person, I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying that who are very good at learning things from the original, and they can get quite dogmatic about the thing, and it misses the spirit of the thing. So I'm a bit more open to the yin aspect, to the receptive mode, to expanding the receptive mode, to learning what you need to learn, to building and to take from the various contexts.
To jump back to the recent interview we did on the Fatima prophecies, one of the words that came up in the context of our conversation then was the idea of apostasy. And that, to me, does suggest kind of a rigid approach, that the very word seems to say that in the realm of religion or theology, there's a right way and a wrong way, and apostasy definitely must be the wrong way. In fact, I get the impression one might even think of apostasy as the worst evil. A previous guest, Charles Upton, described it as worse than corruption.
Now, the question I have to ask is, do you think that that's my word or my use of the word? Do you interpret that as representative of my view or my worldview? Is that what you mean?
Well, I got that impression from the interview, and so I want to clarify that with you.
Yeah, no, my use of that is as a technical term that is consistent with the description of a person who is a traditionalist who is using this, for example, in the context of Malachi Martin. So I wouldn't use the word in relation. I wouldn't describe anyone as an apostate. I'm not using that as my term, because I'm not talking from a religious tradition or a traditionalist perspective in that. That is the term that people would use. That is the term that Malachi Martin used to describe what happened. It's the term that the Protestants and I think the Mormons and others use in relation to the Catholic Church at a particular time, the Great Apostasy. So it's a term of art. And I think in these discussions, sometimes I notice with some of the viewers, they fail to distinguish the argument and the present. When one presents an argument, and especially when one is presenting an argument of somebody else, the argument is not necessarily your argument. It is their argument in terms of art. And apostasy, therefore, is the term that traditionalist Catholics or traditionalist Muslims would use to describe a person who has renounced their faith. It's not my term, so I'm not in a position even to, and I certainly wouldn't call someone an apostate. It's not something that I would get involved in.
Well, I know you did express the idea that Malachi Martin, and I think you would agree Charles Upton, are serious people who you may not agree with them, but I think you feel we need to listen to what they have to say.
Let me clarify that. I'm not renouncing, or I'm saying that this is the term, the term of our apostasy is a theological term, or it's used in particular contexts in the main theologies. In relation to traditionalism, and there is a distinction which is hard to make out sometimes between traditionalism and conservatism. That this is a distinction that Malachi Martin makes very, very much in relation to the different camps. It's difficult to maintain the distinction always. But in relation to tradition and the significance of tradition and the value of tradition, is that it refers, say in the Catholic Church, it refers to a direct connection going back to Jesus Christ. That's the whole idea of the Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. It's apostolic succession in relation to that. So that brings in the culture and the experience going back to the catacombs, going back to the various persecutions, continued on. Because critics are very, very good at pointing to particular epochs and saying, well, that's the Catholic Church, and failing to look at the totality. So in relation to someone that has or refers to tradition, they are invoking a vast literature and theology of discussion where all these issues nearly have been discussed before, including the pre-existing Judaic culture and the significance of that it is a Judeo-Christian culture. And a similar thing in relation to Islam, in relation to tradition, it's going back to the source, and it brings in the whole range. So what I'm very, very conscious of when I'm talking to some of my friends and some people who I would share a lot of similar views on, I find them very weak in relation to their knowledge of the traditions. Before you reject the tradition, you have to know what it says. And it makes some of the, I won't say new age, but some of the, to use as a general gloss, some of the people that talk about these issues seem a bit flimsy because they fail to acknowledge that these debates have been going on for hundreds of years. And as well as that, we can't reinvent the wheel. There's been knowledge of these issues, discussion of these issues, say angelology or demons, or what these creatures are. And we can't dismiss that. There's been a tendency in the 20th century, especially with scientism, to say, they're bad, let's get rid of it. There was nothing there, nothing to see here. And this is a very, very dangerous, very, very dangerous idea. My view has always been, from a perennial philosophy perspective, that we look at the traditions and we take the learning from them, we inform ourselves of them, especially before we criticize them or knock them over. And I think a lot of the points that Charles Upton makes are very, very relevant, and especially from his experience, that he has explored the different areas. So I'm very, very sympathetic to that. And and another issue which is relevant about this is that there are a lot of incoherent spiritual ideas that seem nice, where I say, oh, Jeffrey, you don't have to worry. Whatever you decide is fantastic, and you're always going to be right. And when you go into the next world, everything is going to be great. You're going, and then you have all these simple things, which, telling people that everything is going to be great, and, they don't have to do anything, and they're perfect as they are. That's fine as it goes, but it's not really. A lot of the spiritual traditions don't say that. And for example, I'll give you one example. There's a lot of people that I respect. And even you can see this in Houston Smith, and I have great respect for him. But he does a thing that a lot of people do that says, oh, life, and he has respect for all the traditions. And they do a thing where they say, it's all about the light and moving towards the light or something like that. And then when you die, you're a drop that goes back to the ocean. So they mix the metaphor, they change the metaphor to water, and a lot of people do that. It's going to be okay. You're just going to go. Well, you're funny moving to the light, and then you're the drop, and saying, well, there is some. You have to question the continuity or the comprehensiveness or the coherence of some of the views. Now, I'm not criticizing Hughes and Smith, but there's just some issues when you look at them. They require scrutiny, and when you come to that scrutiny, then you begin to see the weaknesses of certain things. So my criticism of the traditionalists are when you get that ossified, dogmatic, institutional, often taken over, which has taken the spirit out of the issue and has become a mere ritualized, formulaic, dead thing where the spirit has left. And I do get that sense. I mean, I've said to you before that I have a strong feeling that, like Elvis, Christ has left the building. And this is a feeling that has left the church in many senses. That the spirit is not there when it becomes over institutionalized or abused. And that idea, Swedenborg had that idea as well about the temple within, and it was the same for a lot of the mystics, that if you didn't have a spirit within you, if you didn't acknowledge your own spirit, well, then that was a big problem. And one more point about traditionalists, perhaps, and it goes back to the apostasy issue. It's interesting when you look at one of the worst sins, if you like, in Catholicism or in Christian doctrine is there's 100 different viewpoints about what this means, but it's a sin against the Holy Ghost, or the attribution towards the devil of something that the Holy Spirit did, or it seems to be at base a denial of the Holy Spirit, and Jesus says, you can offend against the Son of Man, but not against the Holy Spirit. So there is an idea that the greatest sin is not all the other sins of the flesh, and that is the denial of the Spirit itself. That's the way I interpret it, which is very, very interesting, because often people get obsessed with sins of the flesh, robbery, whatever, and they fail to look at the really important central elements. So when you look at some of the central elements, it's a bit of a surprise. Hence, in the Christian context, that Jesus could forgive or say to the robber beside him that he'd see him in paradise.
I'm reminded of our previous interview, one of the early ones we did, as I recall, on the left hand and the right hand paths. And if I remember correctly, you made a point of saying we here on the earth need to have a sense of balance between these two approaches. Yeah,
the left hand path, the right hand path, left politically, right politically, left hand brain, right hand brain, it's a major dichotomy. Now, one idea, I wrote a book which I didn't publish I had it written about the time I went over to CEO, and it was about the idea of the foreshore, and I'll explain that in a second. But I had it written. The reason why I didn't proceed with it was because the things I had said in it, like roadblocks in Ireland and the police, etc., they hadn't happened. It wasn't even on the cards, and then they began to happen. So by the time my dystopian book was merely yesterday's news, by the time I had come around to it, unfortunately, there's a bit of a bad premonition there. But I'm very interested in the idea of the foreshore. So the foreshore is the intertidal zone, the area between high tide and low tide. So it's a bit we might walk on the beach. And I think this, for me, it's a crucial metaphor, a crucial idea. And it's neglected kind of metaphor and motif. But if we think about that area, for some people, it's where life began. A lot of biologists believe that that's where life began. You can see it in a lot of religious traditions. For example, Jesus comes and meets the apostles on the Sea of Galilee. The two apostles, the first two, Andrew and Peter, I think, are there, the fishermen, and there's James and John are out in the boat. So we have this very, very interesting idea of the significance of the shoreline of that area. And in scientific terms, there's been an awful lot of scientific discoveries associated with the beach and properties of iodine and the colours that they use in the church. They're discovered in that area. Amber is found on beaches. Now, amber was the basis of the word, or the word in Greek, I think, was electrons, where electricity comes from. And amber, when you find it on the beach, there's a lot in northern Germany, around the Baltic. Of course, it has flies and things encapsulated. It senses another world. The intertidal area is often the zone between two different worlds. And it's probably one of the reasons why people are very attracted to it. And if we think about that zone, you could be walking on the intertidal zone and the tide is out. And of course, it's a classic example of the influence of the moon and celestial bodies. But the tide is out, so we're walking on what appears to be land. We come back the next day and the tide is in, so it appears to be sea. But if we walk on the area, we know that it's both sea and land. It's kind of one of these areas which is in between, which is both and neither, and it can have all those permutations that like you discussed in the context of semantics. So we have all these cultural stories associated with the apparition on the beach. There's loads of legends about things coming from the sea, about this zone. It is a zone between two different domains. And it's a bit similar to when reading McGilchrist's book about the left brain and the right brain. You have to realize that we're dealing with two different ways of being, and where we have to recognize that what works in one zone doesn't work in the other zone. So familiarity with the middle path, with the path between, which the area which enables you to go into one zone or enables you to go into the other zone or recognize the difference between them is a thing that we have to master to be able to not being drawn to one side inappropriately, or understanding that when we're in one domain, it requires different skills than another. So that idea has been important for me. I think it's an important metaphor. It is there when you look in an awful lot of literature, an awful lot of myths. You see it. There's elements in the Buddha talks about illusion and reality and different shores, and that idea of moving across water. And for me, this is an important zone that you've talked about with Raymond Moody, for example, about that nonsense zone, which is in between life and death, or that nonsense domain where things make sense or don't make sense. The near-death experience is that moving between different zones. So it's also the zone I would associate with, for example, hypnopompic or hypnagogic states. It's an in-between zone, and it's often talking about spiritual practice. One domain I would focus on certain themes as opposed to practices. One domain I think is very important is the hypnopompic state when we wake up. Often, whatever forces are there, your spiritual forces, your subconscious, unconscious, whatever you want to call it, they relate to that precise moment when you come from the sea of sleep, if you like, onto the beach of waking consciousness, and you can catch things. A kind of raft of meaning, if you like, is still there. You can grasp something that will disappear into the other domain. So I think it's very. We should think sometimes, instead of being very dogmatic about ways of looking at issues. Actually, you also mentioned, I listened to you talking with Gary Lockman about Holy Russia. And it's interesting that when he was talking about Alexander Dugin and the idea of land and sea powers, that one of the problems that was anticipated was not having a zone between the land and the sea powers. This was the essence of the problem that was predicted by a lot of people like Brzezinski and all that there had to be a buffer zone between the land and the sea powers. It's the same idea again. So there seems to be, for me, there are certain useful ideas that we can begin to look. And the same thing with the left brain and the right brain. We must realize that we need balance between the two. We need to be able to master the sea when we need it, or master the land or whatever, or work with them perhaps as opposed to master them. We need to appreciate the nature of them, and the same with the anima, animus. Different. There's all these dichotomies where we need balance. We need to understand what they are, how they're different, and how we can interpret them better.
Well, another interesting shoreline, so to speak, an area of interfaces, all of the UFO, UAP, alien contact work, which suggests that those of us here on Earth are in some very mysterious way interfacing with a whole other order of entities. I know Charles Upton thinks of them as being like the classical jinns of Islam, and he thinks we should be afraid of them. But to me, it's also an important border area that deserves exploration.
Exactly. I think that's correct. And as Jacques Vallée talks about, here we have the idea of incommensurability, that we're not able to interpret things in the exact same way. And that ties into Raymond Moody's idea about nonsense and sense, and things are not exactly the same. And that's why also I suggest in some areas that instead of going with a left brain encapsulated analysis of certain issues, that a more poetic or mythic right brain idea may help to give us a key to understand some of these issues. That sometimes when people are too, say, dogmatically left-brained or too detailed, they fail to see the big contextual elements. And it's certainly an area, in relation to Charles Upton's idea, I think that they have to be both good and potentially evil, the same way any forces. So I wouldn't classify them as one or the other. I think there are, I personally think that they may be the jinn in that context, but I think there are other creatures on the earth that do possess people, that move into space, not dissimilar to some of the fairies we've talked about, that more accord with the jinn. But I don't dispute that possibility. But the whole point is, for me, is that if we can't get on with other humans, and we've been living fairly, for a long time with other humans, if we can't get on with other humans, whether they're good or bad doesn't really matter, because the good ones are not going to tolerate if they're evolved creatures, will have a lot of things to say about our behavior, and the bad ones, the bad ones would be the bad ones. But the whole point is that we're not able to get on with others of our own species, and this is the failure of spiritual evolution. So we have to really work with ourselves as well in either of these issues before we interpret. But yeah, I think that's correct. It's whether one sees it in terms of dimensionality or different spaces or just ways that our brain cannot conceive in a physical sense, or even a different order of the laws of physics, because I think if there are different dimensions, we have to have different physical laws. That classic science idea doesn't have to work. But yeah, I think you're right, and I think that's a classic domain where we have to be able to take the good evidence, the good hard evidence that we have from people who've studied these things, but also be open to the mystical thing and find an accommodation.
Well, if I can jump around a little bit.
Please do. Yeah.
One of the issues that has occasionally come up between us in a nice, lighthearted way, but it's worth probing more deeply, is the question of conspiracies and the role of conspiracies, and the idea that there are dark powers trying to, I guess many conspiracy theorists would say, enslave us in some way. And I know you tend to be more sympathetic to that worldview than I do. I think it's a question of degree and not absolute one way or the other. But why don't we amplify a little bit how you feel about conspiracies, and where do the masses of our viewers stand in relationship to potential conspiracies that are affecting us?
Okay, well, let's start from very accepted ground, very acceptable, undeniable ground. If you look at the 1890 Sherman Act in the United States, there's an outlawed of conspiracies, for example. There's if you look, there's a whole range of legislation that the U.S. government has identified conspiracies as a problem. So your government accepts that conspiracies exist. They've existed throughout history. We can go back to all the stories about Julius Caesar, the Romans. If you read the history of the Roman Empire or Gibbon or any of those and don't find a whole lot of conspiracies, well, then you're not reading the books that I have read. Conspiracies have existed throughout histories. The idea that conspiracies don't exist is a daft idea, frankly. It's a crazy idea because, one, they're legally mandated, they're accepted. You prosecute people for conspiracies. It's a fundamental aspect of antitrust law. So antitrust law prohibits attempts to monopolize and conspiracies. Why do people want to conspire, or why do corporations want to conspire? They want to conspire because they can substitute cooperation for competition. They can set prices that they wouldn't be able to do in a competitive market. So there's theories about competitions or conspiracies. Your Supreme Court has discussed conspiracies many times. So we can't say that there's no such thing as conspiracies. Now, I can understand, and especially from a cultural context, or say because certain groups have been made subject of conspiracies, for example, anti-Semitic ones against Jews made by Christians, often made, for example, in imperial context by power structures, often made, we see it standard in relation to the pogroms in Russia. So there are loads of contexts where conspiracy claims are made and they're false. There's no question about that. And also that looking at Irish history and the history of Britain, any time that a government or a power structure is in difficulty, it will find a conspiracy. So this is another thing. The government will identify a conspiracy that has happened. So the idea that conspiracies don't exist is crazy. Then when we talk about elites, I understand, and you're a bit reluctant about the word elites, I think. Now, elite is a technical term as well. If you look in management accounting, you have a contrast between a mass system and an elite system. So elite really only refers to a small number. So the idea that small numbers can do certain things is quite clear. There's no doubt that conspiracies exist. The conspiracies refer to cooperation between, or an agreement between one or two more parties. Now, often these conspiracies are not individuals, because individuals are not very successful unless they're very, very powerful. So often it's entities like corporations. So, for example, there's an ongoing issue in the United States about ownership of Twitter, where Elon Musk is trying to increase his control over Twitter. And there seems to be resistance from BlackRock. So you have these groups like BlackRock and Vanguard that are really have a lot of control in the world. Now, that's not there's no secret about that, but there are plenty of books about how corporations rule the world and all that. So there's no secret that these corporate entities are engaged in control. If you look at the history of the East India Company, the East India Company at one stage had only a couple of hundred people that were running India before the British government got involved in it. Small groups of people can do things. Small group. Look at how many people when Cortez comes to Mexico, a couple of hundred people, and they overthrow an empire. So the idea that small groups of people can't do things is a daft idea as well. Now, then we come to the situation of, well, what conspiracies and who? Well, another point that I have to mention as a political point, it's well acknowledged that Now, I'm not getting engaged in any criticizing or identifying particular groups, but if you look at the idea developed by Gramsci and Trotsky, for example, about entryism, that's part of the policy, the idea that you enter into an organization in order to change it. That's accepted. It's not only done by the Trotskyites, it was done by Huxley and his ex-club in the 1860s in Britain. The scientists infiltrated organizations to take the spirit out of discourse. They took control over it. This happens again and again. It's a tendency in human nature. It's an oligarchical tendency, as Mumford talked about. And if we make it more sophisticated and then begin to look at like idea Chomsky, the propaganda model, and going back to the 1920s and the various ideas about marketing and control, it's quite clear that the media is controlled by the producers or the people who pay for their advertising, for example. I mean, there's no rocket science about that. I mean, it's so we begin. And here's another point. To looking beyond me, for example, there was you probably, I don't know if you come across it, in March in the British Medical Journal, a very respected journal internationally, an article called The Illusion of Evidence-Based Medicine. I'll say it again, the illusion of evidence-based medicine. So what this article is arguing is because of the control of the apparatus of the production of medicine and pharmaceutical companies, that we don't have evidence-based medicine. It's distorted. Now, that's a standard by respectable people in a respectable journal very, very recently. So what we have is a distortion impact. Now, sometimes these are structural issues. They happen because of convergence or opportunistically, or it doesn't mean there's a whole load of people, nasty people necessarily coming together, although that happens as well, because there's plenty of cases where people were prosecuted for fixing prices, for dividing markets. And if you look at even the history of, look at San Francisco. Why is San Francisco more important than San Diego? Because it was associated with the railway line and where the railway line came to, and the control of the railway line was an important infrastructural element in the growth of San Francisco, as opposed to other possibilities. Or why Los Angeles grew, why it grew like it did. Again, there is a book about the use of growth of cities as a scheme in economics, and how we can have artificial growth to satisfy corporate needs. So again and again and again, there's evidence, there's empirical evidence of the use of structures to achieve the interests of small groups. So it's inescapable that groups, for example, like, say, the World Economic Forum, a lot of people didn't accept that these groups were doing anything. People are becoming a bit more aware of their very strong desire to exert force on the evolution of global governance. For example, I have talked to two people that were in Mandela's first cabinet. I had great conversations with David de Villiers, who was actually in the old apartheid government, and Mandela kept him on in his new government. And he's an interesting man to talk to. Remember, they had nuclear weapons as well at the time of the changeover before that, and they had the big issues about nationalisation of the mines, for example. Kader Asmal was a minister in the government as well, and he used to be one of my teachers in Trinity. I met him when I was over in Lesotho when I was working over there. So if you look at, for example, the big issue there, one of the big issues was about nationalisation of the De Beers mines, for example. Now, I remember Kader Asmal, and in his courses on international law, he founded the anti-apartheid organisation in Ireland. And there was a lot of context about nationalisation, but nationalisation never happened, because Mandela went in 1992 to the World Economic Forum, and basically he was told that it wasn't going to happen, so it wouldn't be acceptable internationally. So despite whatever power Mandela had, there are these economic, commercial forces that exist out there, and they're real forces. And the military-industrial complex was one that's identified by presidents in the United States, that it's clear to people that it exists. That California is very dependent, as you know, on a lot of the military-industrial complex. Now, we can argue all the good points for that as well, but associated with that is the growth in surveillance capitalism, as Zuboff has charted, in the growth of secrecy. And a lot of this comes back to, there's clear historical traces. For example, in Bletchley Park, there was the beginnings of cooperation between Britain and the United States in surveillance and espionage, etc., that became very, very pervasive. And that was something that Churchill was very big on. He said that the English-speaking world had to cooperate in relation to the future on these issues. So to deny those issues is and last point, Jeffrey, I wrote a book, Blue Lives September, which had a scenario of a natural disaster in London, lockdowns, etc., leading to kind of draconian legislation and medical intervention. So I wasn't far off the mark on some of these things. I said, I did an interview, or Paul Check asked me for my predictions for this year at the start of the year before. A number of the things I've said, unfortunately, have come true. I said we'll have a low-level war in Ukraine or in Taiwan. I said there will be, we will hear about contingency of governments. In the same week, in the first week in January, the British government started talking about contingency. So if your hypothesis becomes or can interpret what's going to happen, there must be some kind of validity. I'm not just some kind of nutter who is anticipating. So yes, I do. And so then to follow back, when you say about mainstream media and that, I would find it, no, I don't. My father used to say he went, although he's from an Irish Republican background, he was actually in the RAF for a couple of years. And I remember when I was small, and I said, what do you think? I said, he was telling me about the people that were there in Egypt and places. And he'd tell me that the Black Watch, they're from based in Dundee and in Scotland. He said they were the ones that most people were afraid of. They were the toughest ones. And I said, what do you think of the Americans? He said, I found them very innocent. No, this is a strange thing, and I couldn't figure out that. But he found them very innocent. Now, meaning, I don't know, naive or something like that. So, the argument, the question might be whether one can be, and in this case you, can be too trusting about accepting narratives, for example, in circumstances where I will admit that the world has changed radically in the last, and there's evidence that there has been a shift in the nature of news reporting, in the nature of how news is made, and in relation to some of the assumptions that we might have been able to make 20 years ago. So that's the question. But again, and you know, because we discussed this. I remember we discussed in the car when we were going to the airport there, and I know we have a slightly different emphasis, and so that would be the question. Would be back to you whether your attitude might be a bit too trusting of institutions that don't deserve the trust.
Yeah, I suppose I do tend to be trusting. I tend to want to give people the benefit of the doubt. And at the end of the day, I keep coming back to my mantra, love everybody and everything all the time. That's a pretty difficult thing to maintain these days. But I see, on the other hand, a kind of a distrust that seems pronounced, like, with regard to technology. I think you're pretty convinced that technology is on a path to enslave humanity.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And now, I have no objection to technology per se. I'm not. And people say, "Oh, you're using technology." I understand all those arguments. I embraced technology. In fact, one of the early ideas I had was about putting interviews on the universities' networks, which was before I heard people talking about podcasts and that, but nobody understood that it might be a useful thing to do. But anyway, that's another. So I've always been aware of the possibilities, and maybe that's why I'm concerned about what's going to happen. The idea that I'm working on at the moment is about automation and what automation is. So I do believe that we're heading towards an automated transhumanist technocracy. So that's what I believe is happening. And that associated with it, and this is a very left-brain driven idea, that the idea that we can automate everything, we can standardize everything, and that the human becomes more and more automatic and manageable. Now, again, you say, well, that's a daft idea, and then people begin to kind of project, not saying you, Jeff, but people can say, oh, you're just kind of feeling anxious about things, or, you're a bit paranoid or something. But this is what the World Economic Forum is saying. This is what Klaus Schwab are saying in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. They're becoming open about it. So it's not me inventing things. I have been anticipating these things. Now we're into a phase where things have moved so quickly that they can afford to be open about the fact that people will be getting implants, and that everyone will have to get implants, and that you're going to be made dependent. So that transhumanist issue, even in the space of a year, Jeff, has become people have become a bit more aware. In fact, the scientific and medical network are going to be talking or discussing this soon in relation to the dealing with the challenge of transhumanism. So people are taking these things seriously. The fact of automation combined with that is another element that we're going to be living in an automatic world. And as people like Jacques Ellul anticipated, that this automatic machinery drives out the organic, and unfortunately we're the organic element that will be driven out. There's an idea of a kind of misanthropic approach to the human, when Yuval Noah Harari is saying that humans are hackable animals, and that, I mean, they're open about that now. This is the standard viewpoint of some of these people on the elite level. So by elite level, we mean a small, relatively small bunch of people, technocrats, whatever, people with a certain viewpoint, that combine across boundaries, across discipline, utilizing a loose idea of scientism to bind them together, which is above ideology. That's part of the ideology that can unite different people. So yes, I believe that we're getting to a point of no return, that the literature is there, going back to Bernal, says it was going to happen 100 years ago. And again, conspiracy, H.G. Wells wrote the book, The Open Conspiracy. So it's an open conspiracy. This was even propagated by people like Gerald Heard and other spiritual people. That's well known. The conspiracy is to this elite, as they called it, of scientists that rule the world. That's what they said. That's not what I said. And the idea of transhumanism is central to it. So this is what they have said. I trust them, and all the things that I see corroborate that. So people are discussing a lot of issues that are not really central issues to what is the central issue for me, is the persistence of the universal spirit of humankind, irrespective of whether male, female, whatever identity people want, or Jewish or Christian or whatever. It's the common spiritual heritage that is under threat. And that's a threat and an opportunity. The opportunity is for people to unite on some basis of perennial philosophy, to find the common ground, to begin to not be divided, in order to seek the balance. It's not saying we throw away the technology, but you have to. If you look back at the people that like Delgado was who inserted the implants in the bull, the famous one with the bull, and monkeys, did similar work to Lilly and showed that you could control the brain of animals. Their idea was that we become independent of ecology. A lot of people that are supporting the idea of a technocratic globalism, say for environmental reasons, are going to be sadly disappointed, because these people don't believe that there will be an environment, and this is what John Lilly said, they're going to transcend it, and they don't have any real commitment to the environment, for example. So again, it's one of these issues that there's not a lot of coherence. So then people say to me, oh, you're afraid, you're a bit anxious, and they begin to speak with a patronizing voice to me. But I've come to these, I've accommodated myself to that reality. I have no problem. I think they're going to be getting the shock. And certainly, because I believe in the transcendence of spirit, I don't feel fear about it. But I don't want it for people. And I think they have to be aware of what they're choosing by their acquiescence. So I'm not going to lose sleep over it. I have become aware and accepted those forces, because Arthur C. Clarke has been saying about, since the 60s, for example, about merger and man and machine. It's becoming standard fare for people. They understand that this is going to happen. I think it will be a very bad thing. Do I lose sleep personally? Well, I'm going to resist if someone's trying to stick something in my head. But then again, you won't be able to, because a lot of the new technology is nanotechnology. It could be inserted without your consent, even in the body. So this is an issue. Substances that can change state, for example. And if you go back to if you go back a connection with Bletchley Park, for example, the great innovation. Just let me tell you this detail. It's a bit funny. You know about the Enigma and the Enigma code and that, but the Enigma wasn't actually the biggest one in some ways, because what came afterwards was the Tunney machine. Funnily enough, now that's the Tunney fish, and that was or the British Tunney. So this was the one. The Germans they automated their cipher system, and they then could use one person to broadcast Hitler's messages. So Hitler used this updated automated system. So the British had to crack it at Bletchley Park, and they developed the Tunney machine, and that was Tunny, no reference to the fish. And that was actually seen to be one of the first programmable computers, ironically, in this context. So we often have this dynamic of a bad use of whatever, it's good for Hitler, but bad for the rest of the world, and then a reaction to it, and then we get a dynamic, and that dynamic I understand is happening. But I think there's a lot of people who don't have respect for the human as a species. I mean, they're saying that they don't want the human to persist. They don't believe we have a spirit. They believe it was an illusion, that it was just a fantasy. All those worst materialist left brain dogmas are being codified in a system of rules, and there is no other force to stop it, because they're formed on a global level. There's the Catholic Church is not really a significant player as it thought it would be. There is no opposing force. There is no opposing system. And they will be able to operate with the powers of, say, the United States and other jurisdictions in a coalition, because the technocratic institutions are supranational now, and they can cooperate and associate with that is a great loss of freedom that we will have.
When I was in high school, for example, a very popular book was Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, in which he projects people will be born in test tubes, which I think is what you're getting at. And then he wrote a second book, Brave New World Revisited, in which he analyzed how the things that he predicted in that novel are coming true. So all those tendencies are there. On the other hand, you yourself expressed a real concern earlier that we can't get along with each other. The human race has been plagued by wars and conflict and violence for thousands of years. Some people think forever. I don't think so. But I think a lot of the people who are thinking along these lines imagine that with just a little bit of social engineering, we could eliminate war. And wouldn't that be a good thing for humanity?
Well, yes and no. What Delgado talked about was psycho-civilization. So the idea that you're a bad person, Jeffrey, we found out that you were robbing cars age 4. Remember when you were telling us about the toys, and in one of your monologues you talked about when you were small. So we found you're a bad person. We're going to insert something in your head to stop you being a bad person. Now this is a Clockwork Orange. That's what Anthony Burgess was discussing in A Clockwork Orange. Are you human if you take away these capacities? So but if you look at a bit deeper, that's not really the position they're coming from, because Yuval Harari said it quite clearly. He said, we will be as gods, meaning the groups that control. And he said, we will be both creative and destructive. So they appreciate their capacity for destructiveness as well. Now, this is a fundamental aspect of futurism. If you go back to Italian futurism, which informed fascism and communism, the elements, the motifs were of speed, of war, and love of the machine. These are the same things we find right throughout computer games and right throughout certain visions of the future. So they accept that there is going to be a lot of destructiveness. So the idea that they're doing it in order to make people nice is not true. And then we also have to consider that a lot of the views about eugenics, etc., are part of a Malthusian kind of line which believes that the earth is highly overpopulated and has to be reduced. So in that mindset, especially when you don't have any commitment to ethics or moral standards and you believe you have to be post-morality, as there's certain reports coming out from various military think tanks which are saying that, and we have to think in different ways, well, then the use of violence will increase because they'll be happy to destroy populations. It's part of the game. They can look at them in a Malthusian sense. I mean, that principle applies when we look at empires. They didn't care about the loss of their own people, for example. And one remarkable historical example without going into it, in the 1850s, there was 30,000 Irishmen fighting out in Crimea for the British Empire. It's quite incredible. Some of the use of people, populations, the historical cycles. So the idea that we're all going to be nice because we're re-engineered is not true. We'll be zombies or slaves. That's what the idea is. They've said that. They've said, if you go back to Bernal, that the people that didn't want to be upgraded, and they're talking now about upgrading people, will live in a human zoo and be suitable for experiments. That's what they have said. This is what the famous crystallographer born in Ireland, J.D. Bernal, said in his book, The World of Flesh and the Devil. So this is what the people are saying. They're saying it quite openly now. So the idea that they can control us in that sense is kind of supported by the creation of chaos. Make the world into a very bad place and say, oh, we have to please do something about this. Oh yeah, we'll accept that. Now, my point in all of this is that there's been a certain failure of spiritual evolution. This is both the cause and the solution to it. That we have to evolve. In many senses, the religions, the practitioners, the people, us, we didn't up our game, or we haven't upped our game in relation to how we engage with the world, in relation to the breadth of our knowledge of the world. And this is an important point in my view. I think we have to be panoramic, that we can get too vertical, and those vertical supports need a bit of the warp and the weft as well. And we have to have that vision that enables us to look at different things. Over-specialization and concentration means that specialists are bad outside their domain. And there's a certain interventionist mentality that goes with that, where scientists will intervene in complex situations without understanding the full complexity of the issue, for example, or use tools inappropriately. This is a kind of psychological, in my view, disposition associated with tools. I think they do go together, that absent a commitment to spiritual evolution, we're going to get this anyway. And the choice of spiritual evolution will be taken from us. So there is not a call to arms, but there is a call to defense of spiritual traditions. But that defense must be a bit more enlightened than it has been. It must be a bit more enlightened than saying, well, someone said this 1,000 years ago, and that means this today. There has to be a bit more flexibility, a bit more movement beyond literalism. And there has to be a new way of thinking and a new way of accommodating, I believe, in order for that to work. But if we don't do that, it's clear that the Homo sapiens is finished. That's what the implication of mass network transhumanism. As we become more dependent on the machines, as we become more regulated by the machines, as it affects our behavior, as we're more automatized, then it becomes easier to require us to link into the network. And in that context, where we can have external control, algorithmic control, or centralized control that dictates our behavior, then we have lost the free will that scientists have even denied that we have, as well as denying consciousness, some of them. So that's the great difficulty.
After having had many conversations with you on these topics, I'm under the impression that one of the most central ideas in your thinking is about individual sovereignty or individual autonomy.
Yes, the central idea is of the significance of the person, and that's important in relation to how I see the world, or what aspects of philosophy or phenomenology, for example, that it starts off with the person, and that person, for me, consistent with the perennial philosophy, is a reflection of greater consciousness. And that's a tenet that Huxley would identify with perennial philosophy. He explains some of the tenets in an introduction to, I think it was Isherwood's translation of the Bhagavad Gita. He explains some basic elements. And one key element is that we have two elements, the kind of mundane element and a divine aspect, a reflection. And that's in all the traditions. We know that. So also that consciousness is something which is beyond explanation in other terms. So, for example, Penrose says that a lot of mathematicians believe that mathematics is the explanation and it provides an explanation. He said, but in order to understand the mathematics, there has to be understanding which is there. So that's the same idea that all the mystical traditions say, that before everything is the seer. The seer is the consciousness which is before the personality. That's the thing behind all the other elements that are impermanent. And for me, that's the spirit, and that's the important element. Now, from that, if you recognize your own spiritual consciousness, if you recognize that you have an element which is transcendent, or an element which is part of a greater consciousness, well, then you're obliged to recognize it or to see it in other people as well. Because by definition, the existence of it and the nature of it requires a reciprocity in relation to you recognizing someone else, and to recognize what's behind all the things we might not agree with, what's behind the fact that they seem to be a very bad person in your eyes, or my eyes, or whatever. What's behind that? We have to begin to recognize that that's there. So it's not a recipe for Ayn Rand individual sovereignty, which is a kind of atomistic idea, a kind of Thatcherite idea of the individual as an atom, which is separate in society, that it's self-contained. It starts off at that point that allows us to recognize the other, and then from there can grow the other possibilities. But that's against a materialist viewpoint, which reduces the individual and then begins to say ridiculous things that they should be challenged more about, that there's no such thing as consciousness, no such thing as free will. They've been doing it very successful since the 1860s, no such thing as spirit. And that's why why I listen to your very interesting talks with Bernardo Kastrup, and I tried to get my head around his, which I think I have, his basic argument. I listened to one of his talks which was very, very useful on that. But and he focuses on mind, and that's the domain that he's in. But for me, I want to reclaim spirit for us, for people, because it was deliberately taken away by scientists. They wouldn't engage with ideas about the existence of a spirit. So when Evelyn Underhill talks about spiritual consciousness, when she's talking about mysticism, this is the proper description, I think, of who we are. So consciousness was referred, that was what all the spiritual traditions talk about. Now, there's different emphasis between the traditions, but that's why I want to recover and that idea of the spirit, which is behind and which is bigger. So the individual is an important point. And following on from that is the idea that the individual is entitled to dignity in legal terms. That's the basis of the United Nations Convention of Human Rights. The European Convention of Human Rights is an idea of human dignity, individual dignity. And therefore, the individual has a right to protect themselves against people that want to take away their rights. For example, usually the government. So that the government, for example, if it has a law which interferes with your privacy or your whatever, the individual was, because of their dignity, is able to seek to exert influence that they wouldn't have otherwise. That's the whole basis of human rights. It's the whole basis of the Magna Carta, the right to trial by jury, for example. It goes back to that recognition of the individual. So I stand again for that, as opposed to the idea that you are just a collective unit, that you are part of a collective, you are part of a group. Now, being an individual doesn't stop you being a member of a group, but in relation to, it has different implications. Both fascism and communism sees a collective. Most totalitarian systems seek to build a collective, and they deny individual rights. And that, if there's one thing we should learn from the 20th century, is that we have to protect individual rights. And that was the basis for a lot of the developments in the second half of the 20th century, which sought to protect the individual as against their government, which is unfortunately is the worst conspiracy against them often.
One of the biggest threats to individual autonomy isn't necessarily the government or global corporations. I would call it tribalism. It often starts in the family. You're a member of this family or this clan, and therefore you have to conform to the rules of whatever tribe you're part of. And I mean, growing up Jewish, it starts with circumcision, for example. Or if you grow up in an African family, if you're a female, there's female genital mutilation. That's a way of robbing the individual of their autonomy almost from the birth. Or Chinese foot binding. It's like you have to conform to whatever tribal culture you've grown up in.
Yeah, but you've taken extreme examples in that case.
You use extreme examples as well.
I know, yeah. But in that case, I mean, do you see any benefits of tribalism?
Yes, I grew up in a tribal culture, growing up Jewish. The music was wonderful. There was a very close-knit sense. I still feel a sense of resonance and fondness for other Jewish people. I think there are a lot of benefits that are conferred.
That's right. I mean, I see it in those terms as well. Coming from an Irish context, there was a lot of, again, similar things, similar positive cultural things, a sense of belonging to a certain extent that was there. And, other people might say there are certain negative aspects. That's up to them. There's a double-edged sword in this. Because I understood what was happening in the global terms, I understood, for example, that we can't really, any idea that a person had that we would have something which was an homogenous political unit called Ireland wasn't going to happen. So in many senses, the idea of an homogenous tribal group wasn't going to persist. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's just a fact. I'm a pragmatist. Another important part of my philosophy, and the one that I advocated most when I was in the universities and wrote about, was what I call pragmatic cosmopolitanism. That was the thing that I sought to evolve. Other people have in parallel or whatever, but that was what I came to as a description of my operational philosophy. So I'm quite pragmatic about that, and cosmopolitan in the sense that you have to recognize various forces around the world. And in legal terms, once Ireland joined the European community in 73, that it was no longer independent legally. That's what the deal is. You have referees, European Court of Justice, and they have said that once you join, you are pooling your sovereignty, you're giving up your sovereignty. So a lot of people didn't understand this. The politicians didn't even understand that. So that's now 50 years ago, and people are beginning to say, hold on a second, what about, so you've lost that bus, and I'm sorry to say that, but I don't seem to understand this. At the same time, there was, I have had this question, I've said it before, I've said it I was talking to a chap who, he was an anarchist, I think he describes himself as, and I was saying, well, what would you say in relation to my family that have lived, as far as I know, for hundreds of years, maybe thousands in the same place, and have attachment to a particular area, and have a culture going back hundreds of years, and a language, and do we disregard that in the new world? He said, oh yeah, of course, you can't have blood and soil, you can't have that connection. So and then the follow on from that is, a lot of people then purport to support indigenous rights, but indigenous rights are based on a connection with the land. And so they're either speaking with a forked tongue, or they're not presenting a coherent argument on this, because I haven't told you about the field, Jeffrey. I have to tell you about the field, and this may contextualize some of the issues. There was a play written by a chap called John B. Keane, and the play was called The Field, and it was based on a true story in Ireland, a murder over land that happened in Kerry. So he took that context for inspiration, and he wrote a play. He was one of Ireland's foremost playwrights. And afterwards, they made a film out of the play. Now, the film is not great in many senses, because there was reasons why it was not great. I think they were afraid that the film could be used as a kind of propaganda thing for Republicans because of the struggle over land. So he kind of gave it a King Lear ending that doesn't make sense. And I wrote an article about this. I wrote an article about the field and the concept of the relationship with the land in this. I wrote a legal article in the Dublin University Law Journal. I think they published an academic legal article exploring this notion of the relationship that existed in Ireland with the land. And I was, because I was writing more about English literature, I sent it to Brendan Kennelly, who was an Irish poet and professor of English. He's dead now, God rest him, and in Trinity. And he said, for his opinions, he said, well, you seem to be hammering out your own philosophy. And he said nice words about it. He said, why don't you send it to John B. Keane? So I sent it to John B. Keane, the playwright, and he's a man that I have a lot of respect for. And he sent me a very nice letter. And he said it was the best article he's read about the thing, and that it did represent a lot of his thoughts. And he told me about an uncle of his crying when a field hadn't given the crop that it was meant to do, and it was about this relationship with the land as a living thing, especially if your family has been involved. Now, there's another little connection. So in the film, Richard Harris plays a character called the Bull McCabe, and he was nominated for an Oscar. He didn't get it, but it was a great performance. But when they came to film the field, now I wrote this after the film, but when they came to film the field, they chose a field owned by one of my relations, and so the fella, the old bachelor that lived there, my granddad used to stay with his uncle in that house. They used to foster them out at various times, so for family relationships. So he used to my grandfather used to mind sheep in that actual field, So again, there's this thing about connection with a place. And I used to go down. I used to camp in the field. It's a lovely spot. I used to wander down and be out in the field. It was nice. I saw a rainbow in the field with two ends. One time, there's always rainbows there. The goats would come up. They'd pretend they're not interested. You have to be careful of the goats. They pretend they're not interested in your tent at all. They just ignore you. As soon as you turn your back, they're very curious. They're over, and then they're chewing on your tent all the time. So I used to go into that fella that lived in the widow's cottage, and he was a bachelor, living his own. So I remember asking him about. I was a bit curious because he lived on his own, and a lot of old bachelors live on their own. It's not IKEA, can we say? The decor and that, they're very rough and ready, and the animals used to knock on the door and come. I'm not joking. I was there one night, and there was a knock on the door, and there was a heifer or something knocked at the door and wanted to say hello, or a sheep. There's a little bit off the door where the rooster or the cock could come through, and the cat would be it was all this kind of, it was a bit kind of magical in a way. And I remember asking him, I said, how did you find Richard Harris and all that? Because it's a bit, Richard Harris lived in a hotel in London and on the Strand, and he was a very nice man. He'd come in and sit down and have a cup of tea, which I had a lot of respect for him for, although he was probably looking at this character as a bit of inspiration, because he used his stick, the stick that he used to carry in the film. But the point that I did, I talked about that when I was in Canada with the native people, because if you look at their relationship with the land, it's a deep, real connection with the land. So now we're saying that all that was a nonsense. All that connection with the land was a nonsense. And that people that have no particular affection or love or connection with a piece of land with technology are going to better manage it than anyone that was there. So they have they don't have any love of nature. They don't have any love of particular pieces of land. And these people are going to be better at preserving the cultural heritage. Now, when you walk around Ireland, and the stories about, or they used to be, it's changing quite radically, but the stories, that bush over there had a reference, a particular name that referred to historical instances. There's a whole culture of meaning associated. Now that's going to be lost. And people say, well, that's just history, it's culture. It's a very dangerous issue. So I understand about tribalism, but again, it's about balance. And we're going to lose a lot, because we're saying now about, we need a new accommodation with the earth, but there's no real commitment to it. The accommodation is going to be with technology that manages the earth, and we're told that that's going to be good. But they have great demands, as Lilly anticipated, for example. They have great demands on the earth itself. The idea that technology is going to run these things better is a fallacy, and there's a lot of things that haven't been thought out. So it's the same thing. There's good points and there's bad points. Certainly the practices which interfere with the individual autonomy before the individual can consent to it, I don't support. So I'm with you in relation to identifying particular things, and that comes back to having a sense of protection of individual autonomy and respect for that. In relation to Ireland, for example, and tribalism, it's not going to survive, basically. The culture is going to be a lot more heterogeneous, and those issues, it will be a different cultural value that will hold them together. Now, people say, that's great, everything was bad in it, but there's losses as well. There's losses about culture, about language, about ways of seeing the world. And it seems that we're drifting into a great standardized McDonald's monoculture. So this is an issue associated with coordinated, centralized global governance, that they want everything to be the same. So whereas it used to be interesting to go to a different country in the past to see how they did things differently, we're going to different countries and we're seeing the same thing, in many senses. We're seeing a projection of a particular model, and this is part of standardization. This is part of homogenization. And in that, we're losing cultural distinctiveness. So, I was involved and invited by UNESCO to discuss the future of the World Heritage Convention. And although the claim of UNESCO is to universal heritage, which I agree with, a lot of that is based on respect for, say, local and indigenous cultures. And there has been a very strong metropolitan culture associated with urbanization, which disrespects the land, which looks down on it, which doesn't like anything got to do with the past. And there is an associated permanent cultural revolution which seeks to make everything modern, which seeks to iron out the differences. And it's in the differences and distinctivenesses of the tribes that, for example, as well, that we find distinctiveness. We don't want to go to Africa and say, well, it's an amorphous cultural mass. We want to see the difference between the Maasai and the Zulus, for example, and celebrate that.
Part of the problem, however, with the connection with the land is you sometimes have different tribal groups claiming the same land and actually having a deep connection with it. That's what we have between the Jews and the Muslims in the Middle East. That's what seems to be going on possibly in Ukraine. Here where I live in New Mexico, I understand that there's conflict over land between the Navajo and the Hopi nations. So one of the ways you resolve those conflicts, I suppose, is to try and, wipe them clean somehow and start fresh.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's the fear, or that's the tendency of a lot of solutions, to disregard the differences. I mean, to some extent, there has been a process of dialogue in Ireland with different cultures that had some degree of success. But I mean, it goes back to, you could say, the territorial imperative in the books about our fundamental territorialness to some extent. And the argument that I would put to them is that you're missing the point about, funnily enough, this is the positive side, but you're missing the point about what is in dispute. By the time you have settled your land dispute, the land that will be occupied is your own consciousness. So I say to all the different groups, the land issue is important in relation to try and find an accommodations. And in fact, John B. Keane, it was a warning against being too attached to the land and fighting over land. So that there was a warning in it, and to be careful about not a greed for land. But my argument is that the real battle is the battle for human consciousness. So you can forget about all your land issues, because the battlefield is not on land anymore. It's for the territory of the human consciousness. So by coming together to defend our common universal spiritual heritage, we have to begin to focus on the really significant things, which first is the human person themselves in the connection with other things, because that's what they're fighting for. Obviously, it's an individual actor or a group actor in the context. And from there, from seeking accommodations between the individuals to deal with the phenomenon and the challenges of technology, we can resolve the other issues. Some of these issues are old issues. When I was teaching in St. Andrews, when I delivered a course on international law there a few years, a lot of the discourse was about interstate relationships in international relations, and they're a very highly respected school. But for me, that had disappeared. The significance of it had disappeared in many senses, because we're dealing with coalitions, we're dealing with groups and entities, and that's what you have to look at. It's a similar thing in relation to There's no point in fighting over a field in Kerry or fighting whatever in places for territory in Ireland if it's really your consciousness is the issue. So in many ways, by elevating the discourse to look at the real threats, those issues are made a bit more historic in context. That it's no good. You can have your land, but if you're some kind of automatic zombie on it, it doesn't really matter. And any of the deeper elements will disappear. And people don't take this seriously. So there is a positive way of looking at if, to some extent, we recognize some of the shifts that have happened. It happened with the native tribes in America, that some of them realized that their relationship with the land was, they couldn't have it, and they kind of buried, they had a metaphorical burial of the land or the relationship with. Now there's a bit of that will happen with other countries, with other cultures, as they realize that this world that we're in has changed radically already, that we're in a different zone. Now, I wrote an article, I think it was in the 90s, about the need for a digital remastering of the concept of jurisdiction. I knew that was going to be required. It wasn't going to work in the same way. So some of these things are inevitable. So what I'm saying is that, and again, pragmatic cosmopolitanism, let's be pragmatic about it. Now, pragmatic, as we know, going back to William James, and who also in the Metaphysical Club with Oliver Wendell Holmes and Pierce, they discussed a lot of the technique of pragmatism. Pragmatism is quite useful because you keep an open minded, you're non-ideological, you don't have a predetermined position when you approach the issue. And cosmopolitan in the sense of being a citizen of the world and recognizing the commonality of individuals and the fact that we share the same globe, as well in relation to analysis of problems, and then begin to seek the areas of correspondence. Some of the issues that people are fighting for won't be able to survive in the same way. The threats are different threats. The threats are from corporations sometimes, or different ways, different ideas about the land. And when you're talking about technology as well, there's also a possibility of alternative technological strategies. There is other streams which are neglected about how to recognize natural systems, ingenious farming, to understand the nature of water, for example, not to approach it in the same macro way with big dams and big industrialized approaches. There are different emphases that we can begin to combine or cooperate on, and begin to use our imagination to present alternative solutions. So I agree with you that some of these disputes are old disputes, and you may win something, but it'll be a Pyrrhic victory if we don't solve the other issues, and they're fundamental issues. And it applies the same principle in relation to disputes, whether they're perceived to be religious or racial or territorial or whatever. We have to find a common space above that. We have to find ways to communicate. So it does feed into that notion of extricating ourselves and accommodating. There has to be accommodation of the other in this.
One of the deeper issues that we as humans face is our biological heritage as primates. And primates, if we look at our primate cousins, the chimpanzees in particular, gorillas and orangutans, they tend to form tribal groups with an alpha male leading the group. And I know you focused on this in the human context, looking at figures like Stalin and perhaps Trotsky and Hitler and Mao, and now we have Putin, where you get an alpha male. And I think the Trump followers sort of see him as this alpha male character. It seems as if a lot of the worst decisions that human societies make is over-reliance on the alpha male, and yet we seem to have a biological predisposition in that direction. I wonder how you feel we can address that.
Yes and no. I mean, for example, I think there's a kind of misreading of the Trump phenomenon in many senses, or I think there's another reading. People forget that Trump's mother was born in a Gaelic community in Scotland. And in some senses, he fits into more of a chieftain, a traditional chieftain. And if he had been seen in that context, people might have understood the methodology of that chieftain thing. There is an argument. I think it's been neglected. I think sometimes in the United States, they fail to see the antecedents and the importance of that. So there is a reading of there is a reading which says yes, it's the alpha male thing, and I certainly understand that, and we could make that argument. Although there is also another argument that that has been changing, that there has been a bit of a shift away from those Richard Harris kind of figures, as they're kind of disappearing in some sense from their presence is not as strong, say, for example, in media. There is some kind of societal shift going on in that sense. In relation to, you could certainly say that in relation to Putin, but I mean, you can say the same thing. It's on both sides. I mean, there's plenty of people in the United States as well that are, fit into that aggressive system as well. So there is a universal element. The explanation, and we touched on it before when we began to talk about the nature of evil, and I've been trying to look or to try and articulate a better standpoint or a starting point to analyze it. And there is the Polish thinker Lobachowski, who I think was a psychiatrist, who wrote about ponerology, and this was an idea about the growth of authoritarian systems from what he'd seen from the Nazis, but particularly from the Soviets. And he emphasizes this systematic nature of an apparatus, and he explains about how, again, not individuals, but how groups of people, small groups of people, can take over. And he said that, as far as I remember, there was usually at the tip, there's about 6% of an organization or a group which make the decisions, and they have a 12% group underneath which they influence. They're kind of people that are kind of nondescript, that will be influenced by stronger personalities. And the thing that he mentioned was that this group he defined as a pathocracy, that there is a pathological element to it, that it attracts people who are effectively psychopathic. Now, he was a psychiatrist, so he should know what he's talking about. He's not using those in an informal sense. So if you looked at the in the Soviet Union or with the Nazis, you have this range of people who are effectively psychopaths who rise to the top. They surround themselves, they can't accept criticism, they surround themselves with a group of yes men or whatever, the banality of evil scenario, Adolf Eichmann, the people who are come with a technocratic approach to it. And he defined a systematic, and he was trying to explain evil in a scientific terms. And there's a lot to be said for this, because none of these systems work by the power of an individual. There's no, to some extent, there has been an exaggeration of certain individuals. Certainly, you can't deny the significance of Mao Zedong or Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler or any of them. But they needed that apparatus, which was equally as important for their survival. They couldn't do it on their own. They needed to be able to have a system. And one of the things that they're very good at, that happens in these systems, is they alienate people that are better than, more skilled at them or more. So there's certain features he identified. And another person who kind of corroborates the significance of this was Jacques Vallée, who in one of his talks, he talked about how easy it had been for the Soviet Union to take over Latvia and Lithuania by coming in, by identifying a couple of hundred significant people in the society and by replacing them or accommodating them into their new system. And this is, again, it's the difference between an elite system which takes over from above by focusing on nodes of power. And this is the thing that Malachi Martin talked about in the church. He talked about the insertion of agents of change in organizations by influential people that begin to change in a system. So now, on the primate point, again, there is an argument, certainly, that archetypal, or for a lot of people, actual hangover is still there. I don't know if it's sufficiently strong, because we will have, as now there is a more access of women to high positions of power. The assumption is kind of an essentialist assumption, because they're women, they won't be as interested in the exercise of power in that way. But I think the CEOs of a lot of the defense companies in the United States are women. Now, the idea that it is an inherently male thing, as a throwback to the guerrillas in the bush, I don't think it's going to be sustainable. I don't think that and certainly it's. I think we have to be to recognise the more systemic element with those elements in it. But none of these individuals can survive without the support of an apparatus, without understanding the culture that they're operating in. And there is a tendency, and this is part of the reporting and the nature of reporting, to one has or seen to personalise the elements or the issues and to identify it with particular people, and they may overestimate the significance. For example, the same with the Trump argument, the idea that there was no discontent among massive ranges of people in the United States, and it was kind of fomented by him. That's not true. I mean, there was a lot of people that felt dispossessed with the changing structures as a result of globalization, which took factories out as a result of NAFTA, a thing that the Zapatistas, the Mexican Indians, understood in 1992 when they rebelled against the Mexican government because of NAFTA. They anticipated that their indigenous corn-based economy would be destroyed. They saw what was going to happen. So there is a commonality of these issues, which I don't think it can be too reduced to that. And I think that there are ways of seeing, like Lobachevsky has explained, which I think we have to see. And why I'm interested in those is because this process is going to happen on a global sense with automation, that in a system which emerges, which is unchecked, where there's no responsibility. For example, there's no international antitrust court. There's no court that will bring companies on a global scale for cooperating or conspiracy. There isn't any world antitrust court, for example. So there isn't the same regulatory system. And in relation to, there's a lot of discussion about war crimes now in the current context. The United States is not interested in, in submitting to that regime. So there's a lot of hypocrisy on this. If they come and say, yeah, we're subject to the same rules, let's look at what we did in all these countries, that's fair enough. But the idea that they can point a finger at other people, usually in Africa or whatever, and say, well, it was all those people, they're all the war criminals. That's not law, that's politics.
Well, I would agree with you that there's a long history of hypocrisy associated with every large organization, particularly governments. And you've just put your finger on a very important one. But actually, as we speak right now, I think the prospect of a third world war has never been higher, and it's rising to the surface. I don't actually see how we're going to avoid it right now. It seems to me that we're almost on an inevitable course, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
My prediction that I made on Paul Check could be wrong, because I said at the time my instinct was a low-level war when I anticipated it. The thing that has surprised me is the desire of people to contribute towards the Third World War scenario. And this is something that I haven't been able to understand particularly, because if a situation is volatile, the last thing you want to do is to increase that volatility. It was totally predictable. It was totally predicted by international scholars. Now, I'm not going on saying either side, but it was totally predictable that if you didn't have a buffer zone between NATO and around Russia, that we would have this conflict. That was what they've been saying for years. That the Russians, going back now, I'm not defending or getting into that, but there has been this idea that if Russia didn't have a buffer, then it would go to war, and that goes back to Napoleon. It goes back to the Nazis. There's all that long history that we know is there. So we know that these issues are tense, and that the issue has been predicted for years. So I mean, there is a bit of an Alzheimer's in the public perception of these issues, that they fail to see that this is a continuous issue. Why, for example, was this so significant that the British Empire went to fight in Crimea in the 1850s? What was that war about? For example, a lot of people have no idea what that war was about, or why they were fighting, or what they were doing over there. Are the issues the same? Are they continuous? We have to be, if we want to be objective and pragmatic, we have to stand outside the immediate events, and we have to stand outside media manipulation as well. And we have to accept that a balanced and nuanced view is not necessarily going to come from our news channel. I was in New York doing a talk at this. I told you before, at a stage when Colin Powell was going down to say about why they had to invade Iraq because of the dangerous weapons and all this kind of stuff. And what shocked me was when I switched between all the channels and the absolute zealousness of the presenters for intervention and the horror that anyone could object to this. And some of the same people now that are still, some of them are still not necessarily on the same thing. So there is an element to it that if everyone continues to contribute towards the tensions by making hasty decisions that should be seen in a wider context, then that we will be effectively inviting a nuclear power or catching a nuclear power in a corner like a rat that will become very dangerous. So then you might ask yourself, well, is there anybody that wants a nuclear war? Now, this is another argument that people are not willing to entertain. You've all these people who spent a long time developing nuclear weapons. You're going back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and remember, if we look at Norman Weiner, whatever you want, remember that one of his changes, and he was one of the great. The father of cybernetics, when he began to realize about the military-industrial complex, and he began to not get involved in certain contracts. And the thing that turned him was when he began to see that the military-industrial complex in the United States wanted to expand 1,000 times its nuclear arsenal, and he began to get very worried and concerned about that. So then the question is, there's a lot of people wouldn't seem to have lost sleep over dropping the bombs in Japan, if you be honest about it. There's people see it as a technical issue, and there certainly will be people that wouldn't have a problem with eliminating millions of people. They might see it in a Malthusian sense, as the British Empire used to do, as as mopping up excess population. You don't know. There's a lot of strange people, a lot of strange people in power, a lot of psychopaths as well. So we don't know that people, everyone right-thinking person, if you like, presumes that would be something that they couldn't countenance. I don't believe that to be the case. They've used nuclear weapons before. So the only thing we can do is to not try and throw fuel on the fire. And certainly, if we don't know anything about the history of the context or the political context, or even the nuances involved, and we must recognize, having lived in countries that are effectively imperial powers, whether say in Britain or that it used to be, or the United States, they're imperial powers. They have used military might around the world. Now, you can trust them if you want to. You can trust them for a balanced view, in the media if you want to. But really, a history is a lot more nuanced. So what I would, what is wrong is to is to condemn the Russian people, for example, that don't have any control over the individuals or whatever, or to exercise hatred against them. They don't have power over their governments, and everyone's heart goes out to the Ukrainians, and they've suffered an awful lot throughout history. And the one point I would say is that it's not the time for saber rattling when we're dealing with a power that might feel like they have nothing to lose in this context. So there's an acceleration. The neutral zone or the buffer zone, they're intent on taking that away. Sweden and Finland considering joining NATO, and I think in Ireland they're even going to consider it. The problem with that is you don't have any honest brokers left when that happens, and you do have a severe polarization. It's different when you're talking about a country that doesn't actually have any nuclear weapons, but when you're talking about a country that has nuclear weapons and a long history of fighting to the bitter end, I think we all have to be cautious, and that's the same argument I would use in any context in Northern Ireland or whatever, that we have to learn. And here's one point, and it's a point that came out of Northern Ireland when I listening to interviews with the Protestant paramilitaries, and a lot of them said, or a few of the leaders that were very remorseful for their role in the context. They said they had been frightened into violence by the middle class people and politicians that wound them up and told them that there was a terrible conflagration coming and all the Catholics were going to kill, all this kind of stuff. And they knew nothing. They acknowledged that they knew nothing about history, nothing about context. And it was only in prison that they began to read about the historical context and began to realize that they had working class Protestants fighting against working class Catholics and policed by working class British soldiers, for example. Everyone, in a way, turned into victims. Now, the problem, what happens in these conflicts is, once people get drawn into it, then you get a license for the psychopaths to get involved in it, the people that like violence. So what emerged from that, were groups who are more interested in butchery, for example. So these things come in any armed conflict. You begin to get people that you don't want to have involved in things. But often that comes because people are not exercising what the Buddha talks about, right speech. They're not engaging in an effort to seek whatever dialogue. But there is behind all that, there is a sense that there's plenty of people that want the conflict and believe that whatever the conflict is, whatever happens will be good. And the last point in that is, of course, the big problem as well is that most of these systems are automated. So when you reach past a certain point, the nuclear weapon systems will be very difficult to control because the automated sensors will misinterpret and interpret things, and that's the great danger. And that will be because the fear has been ramped up that the nuclear weapons will be put into a more automated mode because of that fear.
It sounds like you're basically agreeing with me that the risk of global warfare, global nuclear warfare, is high at this point. Very high.
My instinct was to say that it was a low level. That was what my prediction of it before it happened, that there would be a low level thing. That was what my intuition goes. And I don't know if that has, the levelness will have changed. Whether we will have I don't have a strong instinct, but yes, absolutely. The risk is getting higher because people are, there is a strange sense in all wars, a strange sense about why the people were coming out in the First World War, so enthusiastic about the men going off to fight in the trenches. There is a strange kind of atavistic kind of feeling that possesses people at certain stages, even if it entails their imminent destruction. So there is a strange part of the human mind that gets disengaged in that. So yes, I agree with you. There is a very strong risk.
I was recently asked during a live stream event, I didn't field this question, but the question came up because I've identified myself in earlier monologues publicly as a pacifist. I've been a lifelong pacifist. I'm a big admirer of William James, who was a pacifist, who wrote a wonderful essay called The Moral Equivalent of War. And someone asked me, well, do you feel that the situation in Ukraine is causing you to change your views about pacifism? And I understand the temptation to say, well, we can make an exception here, because if we don't stop this aggression that's going on right now against the sovereign nation, then many other dominoes will fall. And which is an argument, as I recall, that was raised back in the Vietnam era as well. It didn't turn out to be a true argument. But nevertheless, I've heard you express something similar yourself with regard to the situation in Ireland, where I think at one point you told me you didn't think the conflict was worth a single human life.
Yes, because of the fact that firstly, there's a right to self-defense, and I support that, and there's also a right to self-determination. But when we get into the later stages, when these battles are effectively of no strategic value, or they can't achieve their purposes, and where we have secret societies who are susceptible to being taken over, there's a big game that goes on that leads to. Yes, the right to defend themselves, as my own family would have done in the context of an occupying force, when they're arresting your children and breaking into your house when you're giving birth, etc., and putting you in prison for singing songs. In those contexts, you have a right to defend yourself. In the context of, there's a lot of difficulties that, or things that are difficult to understand when you're listening to some of the debates. For example, some of the critics would say that, well, on one stage, we're giving out about boundaries and saying it shouldn't be boundaries, and now all of a sudden the same people wants to enforce boundaries, and it's not consistent. The arguments are not consistent. On one stage, people are saying, well, we don't have any national sovereignty, you're a nationalist, you're bad, you're tribal. Now, the defense. So these are not the issue. So they're not resolvable by people that are speaking with a forked tongue in that context. There has to be some kind of intellectual consistency on that. And if you go back to what Father Malachi Martin said about that the destiny of John Paul II and his interpretation of the future of the New World Order, for example, and things like that, and his own destiny, and the destiny going back to Fatima, comes back to Kiev. It was something got to do with Kiev. If you go back to Brzezinski, who is one of the most significant 20th century and 21st century influence from the United States, going back to Carter as an advisor, and also in favor of technocracy and détente with China and that. And he said he seemed to have the same view, that it was about control of Ukraine. And because this was the boundary, that if Russia lost influence over Ukraine, that would mean that the Western forces had dominated. And then we go back to the Crimean War and say, well, what was the war going on between the Brits and the Turks and the Russians, and what were they fighting over? We see that we have a strategic fault line there that is not necessarily containable in the particular issues of the time. And also that many politicians have been deliberately involving themselves in these places as part of a policy from Europe and from the United States. I did a little bit of work in Moldova, and what it made clear to me was that it was a lot more complex, because you had some of these issues about looking towards Europe and looking towards Russia, and there's quite different fault lines there in the community. A lot of people. There has also been the United States media are very good at forgetting about their interference, or acknowledged interference with what has happened in Ukraine. Now, this is the same thing. So it's very, very easy to manipulate people when they see tragedy, when they see war at that point, to come to a particular conclusion. But if you look at, for example, the interference in Iran or Iraq, the changing of government, come back to the Shah and what happened afterwards, and what happens when you interfere, and this is another tendency of the technocrat, to interfere in complex situations when they don't understand the totality. To have a tool to interfere and say, oh, well, we'll fix it with this tool, and that produces unintended consequences. This has been the long history of foreign policy of empires, of Britain, of the United States. And if you look, I mean, there are articles in the international journals, refereed articles about top-class journals about the role of French foreign policy and the genocide in Rwanda, for example. These things often have factors which intervene from outside. So some of the honest brokers are not as honest as they think. So nobody wants to see suffering, and nobody wants to see people suffer in that context. But there's a bit of hypocrisy in some of these things, because you can pick out Yemen, you can pick out Afghanistan, you can pick out other issues. Nobody was lost any sleep over missiles being fired by nice people from other countries, and so we have to look at it in a broader historical context, informed by some of this stuff, and aware that our emotions are going to be hacked in some of these contexts.
Well, yes, it seems as if it's hard to turn on a television set without feeling that there's an effort to manipulate the viewer one way or another. Usually to have a sense of outrage. It seems that whether it's a right wing or left wing, it's both feeding on the idea that the other side is engaging in behavior that we must stop, that it's outrageous, that it's unacceptable. I had a mentor many, many years ago when I was an undergraduate in college who was also a pacifist, and I think he would have argued that the way to resolve the situation in Ukraine would be to put in massive numbers of people wearing the light blue uniform of the United Nations, unarmed, to go into that situation, to be willing to risk their lives in order to separate these armies from each other and to establish, probably, as you seem to be intimating, and I think Ukraine is willing to agree to a neutral status, but as a sovereign nation with some sorts of security guarantees. I'm kind of inclined to think that, if pacifists around the world were willing to take a risk like that, it might be a better solution than other solutions that seem to involve more weapons and more lives lost.
Again, from my pragmatic policy, the best solution is preventative solution in all cases. And I used to have great discussions about management accounting. And again, you can Deming and statistics. And this is the idea of total quality management, that it's always cheaper to reduce or solve errors early on in the process. That when you let it go to the end, it gets more expensive and more expensive. So it's always better. I mean, prevention is better than cure, for example. But it's complicated. When I was in Trinity College, there was a chap I used to see. He used to sit near me when I was reading my law books, and his name was Conor Cruz O'Brien, and he was out in the Congo at the time. He was Under Secretary, I think, to Dag Hammarskjöld. So he was involved in some of these issues, and you had there was a lot of complicated stories about the Irish peacekeepers. Now, this was a role that Ireland did play. This is why you want neutral countries. They have a long tradition of peacekeeping roles for the United Nations, and there was a number of them killed in the Congo in that context because of, again, complex scenarios about international signaling and how they operate, so they can still interfere with these contexts. The basic proposition is that there are forces in the world that don't want peace. Peace is not what they want, and they don't care about the Ukraine. There are plenty of people that want to intervene militarily in these contexts that have no care about the people of Ukraine. And according to the studies of people that rise in organizations, and according to ideas of ponerology and that, they're psychopathic. They lack empathy, but they know that they can manipulate you and me in relation to our emotions, or any one normal person, because we have emotions and we're going to respond to it. And so the bigger questions are, why are the armaments industries so successful, and why is this big infrastructure being allowed to grow? Because we know that there's people that make weapons, and Sweden as well is a neutral country, but it's a very big arms industry that people forget about conveniently. So it's kind of, again, there's a bit of a conflict there in that context. So we have the people that make the weapons, and they make the contracts, and are very, very happy because they get their deals. War is a racket, all those studies. And then we have a whole range of institutions in between, which are the kind of soft face of the military-industrial complex. There's a whole lot of foundations and bodies which support particular strategies in a geopolitical sense that will facilitate certain interests of the thing. And a lot of public funding goes into these organizations. So until that apparatus of the military-industrial complex is solved on a global scale, we'll always have this arms race. If it's not, it'll be Ukraine. There's going to be other ones on the way. We could make a list of them where these tension points are going to happen, where we're going to have war and we're going to have struggle. And then if you go back to Malachi Martin, and what Malachi Martin was very good about was writing about, as he saw the New World Order, and he said that people didn't pay attention when a young bishop, Karol Wojtyla, who became John Paul II, went to America in, I think, 1976 and gave a talk explaining that the world was changing, that there was going to be this new world order effectively. And later, Gorbachev used the same term. So what he saw it as subsequently was a clash or a struggle. John Paul thought that the Catholic Church might be able to play a role as in the New World Order, but he saw it essentially between Russia and the Western nations, commercial nations. So clearly the Catholic Church is no longer a player internationally, although he envisaged it as being. So on his analysis, and he was very, very astute about international affairs, we have a clash between the Western powers, to be like, consistent as well with what he said, or what Lockman said about Dugin, the Western powers and Russia at this stage. And in those terms, it's merely a prediction of the struggle for the New World Order, and therefore, in that analysis, the joining together of NATO, etc., the joining of neutral countries is merely a movement towards that order. And that was what was anticipated by people like that became the future John Paul. So that's not me saying it. And they were the terms he used. And they were the terms that Gorbachev used in his 88 speech about the New World Order. So there was a bit of a different emphasis from Martin. He believed that the Soviet Union hadn't gone away. It was a big lie that the Soviets, or the Leninists as he called them, hadn't gone away, and they were merely changing shape, and they believed that they could have more influence in the West. That was his analysis. It's very, very complicated.
At this point in time, we don't just have two major poles. It's not about communism versus capitalism anymore. We have, for example, China, which is both communist and capitalist, and they seem to be, a rising power. Some people have speculated that China is the one who's going to benefit from this conflict between Russia and the Western democracies. And we also have people such as my old friend Jason Giorgiani, who feel that if we don't launch a war, initiate a war against China right now, we will, at the end of the day, become enslaved by the Chinese. So that our personal autonomy and freedom depends on destroying Confucian culture, as he would put it.
There is a slight paradox, and there have been, if you want to call them conspiracy theories, but just theories about the future evolution of these global interests. And one idea was that which there may be something in it, was that forces, partly in the West, that wanted to destroy the hegemony of the US because it's seen to be negative, would encourage it to overreach itself, with the idea that it would no longer be the hegemon because of its overextension. Now, and therefore, that what would happen eventually would be that the United States would fall subject to, and China or whatever would take over. And strangely, Brzezinski he believed that the Soviet Union would fall, as he was correct, because of its involvement in Afghanistan. Strangely then, you had the United States getting involved in Afghanistan for no strategic benefit and at a great loss to itself. And there's a line in the Tao Te Ching that says, what you want to destroy, you first extend. And it's a principle, the same in judo. So someone hits you and you use their momentum and continue to help it on its way. So there is a theory that has been in some circles that by encouraging the United States, or some people believe that the hegemonic force in the world, the United States, the only way it could be destroyed was being overextended. Some of these things will overextend it, and then you can have something which is more globally run. But then, of course, you have to factor in the possibilities of other centers of power, the new countries which are emerging in India and Brazil and the Southern Hemisphere. And people forget about Africa in all these contexts. I think that Africa is the greatest ignored power in all of this. And Africa has a great potential to restore a lot of land. It has so many natural resources. There's interesting sociological forces happening there. And if you talk to some of the native people, they say that the healers of the world are the ones that are the Africans. So they see that part, and it's often ignored. I can see in the future that there will be migration from Europe to Africa, which people don't see happening at the moment. But so circumstances will change, but we can't get away from the fact that there are a lot of psychopaths in power, that are a lot of people playing games, there are a lot of people using projections to manipulate power. And Dugin said in an interview, that Russian chap that you were talking about in Holy Russia, he said that when he talked to Brzezinski said that there's only one player, which is the United States. So they're the only player on the chessboard. So they make a move and then they turn the chessboard and make a move from the other side. Now, that was an idea I had in one of my books. I didn't know Brzezinski said that as well. I think we're in chess games, but we don't realize that the both sides are being played, or it's only about just before checkmate that we're allowed to notionally move our own pieces.
Well, we began our discussion talking about mysticism and the role of personal autonomy, the various forces, whether they're governmental or commercial or tribal, that seem all pointing at trying to, I think you used a wonderful phrase earlier, hack the individual. Somehow. So the real question, I think, that emerges in this crazy world that we find ourselves in today, how does one find the balance between social engagement and the pursuit of personal autonomy to the extent of true spiritual breakthrough and mystical awareness?
Again, in relation to a strategic point, I'd emphasize that idea of the foreshore, and we said in the balance, the bit in between, the bit that doesn't get involved in things but is aware of both and seeks to navigate a way between places. There's an important point. Another philosophy which would be consistent with mine is a philosophy of illuminationism that is usually associated with Suhrawardi, going back to the 12th century, with Sufism, but it's in all the traditions. It's in the Kabbalah, it's in Lurianic Kabbalah, and the ideas of light and whatever. It's universal that we've talked about before. So in the philosophy of illuminationism that Suhrawardi talked about, and this is a good few hundred years ago now, 800 years, whatever. He emphasizes the epistemological reality of illumination, the idea that revelation is a source of knowledge. And this is what materialists deny, that the nature of intuition, the nature of knowledge, one part of that is that inspired element, the illumination, the light from above. So we get noetic information, we get ways of seeing things, we get clarity from other sources. Now, this is consistent in a way with Ian McGilchrist's argument about the importance of the right brain, which understands the totality of things, which understands the context, which doesn't see the world in an isolated way. So there is a need to see the world differently. So the first thing is to, in my view, accept that you have this great consciousness within you, which I would call the spirit. But if you don't want to call it spirit, you have this great consciousness. The second thing is to understand that that consciousness is a force which you can activate and apply. And that's the idea of evolution. It's the idea of self-actualization. It's the idea of applying it. It's what Maslow learned, that the people that achieve things had often gone through that mystical journey. And by nature of being able to achieve things, they had certain competences which came from perhaps a clarity, from the illumination within. So inventors, people with solutions, creative thinkers, right side brain thinkers, people that can interpret things differently, they're the people that you need to come into context to help. So we need that solution. So when we're going through these things, we have to be careful about polarization. You know, you're Jewish, you're Muslim, you're Catholic, you're Protestant, you're this, you're that, you're traditionalist, you're conservative. That binary element, or that dichotomization, is a thing that empires do all the time, and they're experts at that. And then they come along and say, oh, look, you guys have been fighting, after they create the dichotomy. Vaccinated, unvaccinated, it's relentless. Trump, anti-Trump. So we must be careful not to be dragged into this, and to find, even though we're sympathetic to one side or the other, to find a space in between where we can have dialogue, where we can respect the other person's opinion. But nothing will happen without the recognition of our spiritual consciousness, which enables us to see other people, not to condemn them, to dehumanize them. There has been, again, as always in the discourse about war, we get into a revolution of dehumanization of the enemy, of denigration of the enemy, and I understand where it comes from, but that can be overextensive, and it can contribute towards the wheel of misery and the things that the Buddha warned us about. So the reality of having an evolved the difficulty is for people to begin to unite across. They have to find a space above their religions. I think that any unity or any attempt to capture such movements will fail, because that's what the lesson of history is, that institutions are subject to capture. So that we have the possibility of more and more individuals connecting across boundaries, across religious difference, that can be active in their own domains. What they have to be careful about is that they understand the game that they're playing. Now, for example, I was very, very interested in the environmental movement going back to 70s and 80s, an early stage when I was growing up, and I was willing to be active in that. And I did briefly. I remember putting up when you weren't supposed to be, with a fellow from Sinn Féin, putting up because he had experience in putting up illegal posters. Well, posters that you shouldn't be putting up in places about meetings for protecting people in the Amazon and whatever like that. But I got very cynical when I began to meet some people in the organisations. Not about that one, but about some of the environmental movement. I didn't see any interest in the environment. I began to see that there were other elements involved. So you can dedicate your life and your energy to a particular cause, but having seen how political systems work and the dirty, my father always used to say that politics is a very dirty game, it is, and we have to be very, very careful about not being manipulated. And the only way we can be careful is by being nuanced and by informing ourselves in a broader context about the issues involved, because otherwise we'll just be manipulated by algorithms, by our emotions. They have so much information on us, we're becoming automatic. They can tell what our preferences are. They can the machines can manipulate us, as we're talking, and polarize us. We have to be very, very careful to navigate those paths. And we have to be very, very careful about being certain. One of the great things about the pragmatic viewpoint is that they were very aware of uncertainty, and they were very comfortable with uncertainty. It's a thing I like about Philip K. Dick. He doesn't get certain about his views. He says, it could be this, but then it could be that. And he can hold conflicting things in his head at once. He can hold conflicting analysis. And that's a very, very healthy way. It's also in relation to the nature of inductive thinking, for example, about where you have uncertainty. It's necessary to have a disposition that's open to nuance. I think also that we have to be imaginative, breaking out of, as you were saying about the tribes, but breaking out preconceived notions that are imposed on us. Because often we become straitjacketed, or you can't behave because you're a member of this group and you can't therefore communicate with that group, or this different way, or this is what they think and this is what you think. And we don't actually go across the boundaries. We don't communicate with people. So it's very easy, for example, to have a very narrow view of what a Muslim believes without looking at the totality and the vast range of views within that. It's very easy for people to manipulate a certain viewpoint of what we think. Or the same thing about Israel. And I mean, people are surprised if they study it when they begin to see that some of the religious organizations are very antithetical towards the state of Israel, for example. They don't have the views that people attribute towards the religious cultures. It's a lot more nuanced and counterintuitive. So there's always a need for nuance and a need to understand complication. But it has to come from, in my view, from some prior idea of who you are and who we are. And the idea, which I think is inherent in all spiritual traditions, that we're meant to evolve. And the evolution involves tackling some of these issues and utilizing those imaginative aspects to begin to find the commonality, to find solutions to some of these issues.
Well, you brought up Suravardi, and as I understand the history, well, 2 points I'd like to make about him. One is that the philosophy of illumination, as you described it, suggests that it's a strong adherence to the notion of revelation, meaning, I think, the holy books, the Quran, probably specifically, but it also implies a strong adherence to gnosis, to the idea that the individual can open themselves up. And I think it was that conflict between gnosis and revelation, external revelation, that led to, as I recall, Suravardi was beheaded.
Yeah, there was this dispute, a theological dispute about the consequences, and we know that this consequence is there for all the mystics. And my sense of when he was talking about revelation, I meant to include, as you said, the Gnostic sense, which is the sense of personal revelation as being very, very critical or significant as well for him. But he was very, very clear that the individual could access true revelation personally. Now, for literalists, this is always a problem because they say, well, no, the things can only be a particular way. And this is the great conflict in all religious traditions between the literalist and the more kind of poetic, purposive interpretation. And this is a great difficulty which still persists. I can see it in relation, well, there's a strong current in certain ideas of Protestantism about the literal meaning and failing to see a broader context. It's certainly there. It's there in all the traditions. And although when you go back and look at some of the Sufis, for example, these ideas are not necessarily in conflict because are not necessarily in conflict. They do become in conflict when we have that dichotomization. But most of these chaps accepted the premise of the foundation and then began to explore different levels of interpretation within the boundaries and began to emphasize, for example, statements or surahs about the lights in the context of the Quran, and began to expand on them and began to integrate the Greek thinking to inform his thinking. So yes, that's a critical element, and I feel close to him on that. That his notion of revelation was an affirmation of gnosis in context, if you like. But he, and this is crucial because a lot of scholars don't seem to emphasize the fact that this idea is there for so long, that when we come to epistemology and ideas of knowledge, that the idea that we could intuit truth, which then could be provable in some sense or had validity, is a thing that they can't accept because this is inconsistent with the materialist paradigm, and it's a very, very important element. But this is consistent with all the great scientists. It's consistent with all a lot of the inventors, that they get the solution first, and then they work back through the issue. That there's some sense that that information comes to the seer who is behind the personality. It comes in that dialogue and that discourse in some mysterious way, akin to mysticism. So, by the same token, those are the realms of possibility that we have to explore more, because we can't solve these issues with a left brain issue. There's seeing things as isolated, decontextualized, without emotion. And Suravardi, I think, he is relevant to people today. So the illumination would also talk to the heart of people, which is beyond our emotions and beyond our rational sense and beyond our, frankly, ignorance of a lot of affairs, the things that we don't know what's going on, and to look behind those issues and to look critically at some of these issues. I think he's very relevant, and I think his philosophy of illumination, as well as his mystical approach to illumination, is as we've said, or I've said before, is it's one of the most consistent elements in the perennial philosophy. It's one of the ideas that can unite a whole range of people, and the unity has to be pragmatic. So if you have a mystical experience and you tell me about something, it has to work in some sense, and that's the pragmatic sense. So if I'm talking a whole load of nonsense as a result of mystical experience to you, and it doesn't make sense, it's worthless, really. So that's where pragmatism comes into it. Pragmatism as a philosophy is based on what works, before it became complicated by Rorty and other people afterwards. In its simplest statements by Peirce and by James, it's about what's the consequence of this view, and what works in practice. So William James would have been the same as well. Okay, I accept all the variety of religious experience. What's the consequence of this particular view? If the consequence of the view is, well, go home and do damage to your grandmother or something, I say, well, that's not useful in the context, and that's where discernment comes into it. But I think some of these, a lot of the mystics, as we know, come to a gruesome end, but they wouldn't have changed it otherwise.
I suppose that's certainly true of Suravarti. But let me ask you this question about Gnosticism. I used to feel that Gnosticism is a wonderful thing. It has to do with personal gnosis, the idea that we each have the capacity to see reality directly if we're willing to face it. And then I learn that there's a tradition amongst various Gnostic organizations and Gnostic cultures. It may be why the Catholic Church felt at one point fully justified in trying to eradicate Gnosticism. And that tradition is that this world, this physical world, is ruled by evil, by archons, or even by Satan. I don't think that was the realization that Suravarti arrived at, but it seems as if there's a kind of confusion between opening up to the direct awareness or apprehension of the truth on the one hand, and then on the other hand, arriving at a kind of very pessimistic vision of the world, that everything in this physical world is ruled by evil.
And this is the issue of balance. And the good thing about the left brain is it can give us some balance to filter. And that's why the disciplined element of the traditional schools of theology, of the literalists who look at the detail, is important. And that's why they can't be dismissed totally. And there's an idea that everyone has the same access to truth. And a very popular phrase here from the United States, Oprah Winfrey, and that about your truth and my truth, and you get into difficulties if we don't have anything which can be objectively seen to be true in some sense. If we remove all idea of truth and we make it relativistic, and relativism is a big problem, and it's a big problem of a lot of people that I respect, and I have these debates with them about, well, you know, what do you stand for at a certain point, and what principle? And sometimes they do stand for the principles, but there's an unwillingness to acknowledge it. There seems to be an unwillingness. When I listen to a lot of spiritual discourse from the United States and certain, or maybe New Age thing, maybe more Californian context, to accept the idea of responsibility. There's been an idea that what you do is this is what I get a sense of. It's down to you, and you know it's about your experience, and it's individual, and it's kind of solipsistic, and it's all about you knowing things and what you know is right and your truth and all that kind of stuff. And it begins to lay down a foundation which doesn't have an orientation. Suravarti and the Suravarti and his tradition was about orientation, and an orientation to, if you like, a higher consciousness, a divine light. But there was an idea that there was some truths, And when you look through all the perennial philosophy, there's recurrence of certain truths about not killing and about being truthful and as general propositions. Now we can talk about the exceptions all the time, but I mean accepting the general principles about some notion of mercy or compassion and honor, etc. So sometimes some of the Gnostic traditions seem a bit relativistic, and there is also that idea when I'm reading about the Catars and what the Catars suffered was terrible. So I'm not doing it as a support context, but when you look at some of the certain groups which were Gnostic, they not only were they Gnostic, but they had a deep distrust of physical things in some sense, according to reports. And again, these may be complicated, so that there are complications in the reality of our historical access to what they actually believed. But I certainly don't believe in this idea about physical reality being ugly or bad, and I don't think, for example, Philip K. Dick expresses some things in that form. But I don't think he was talking in terms of the physical world. He was talking in terms of a spiritual nature. So the ugly things he saw were kind of a spiritual nature, but they weren't the totality, because that was the whole nature of the vast active living intelligence intervention, or of God intervening. So the idea that there is a domain, if you like, a demonic domain, which is there, or different forces or consciousnesses, but which is surrounded by a divine force, is a kind of recurrent one, and it's even reconcilable with some of the ideas in Catholicism. It's closer to some of the cosmologies and cosmogonies in there. But I certainly don't have this. I certainly don't believe that gnosis requires that one has this antithetical view of the human body and the human mind, and I don't subscribe to that. I think the issue is not of the limitation; it's of our own limitation, of our own possibilities, and there can be a self defeating prophecy, a self-fulfilling prophecy around it. The other thing is that a lot of Gnosticism, in its classical sense, as we're beginning to understand from the documents that were found in the various caches that were discovered, had a lot of detail about it. That's kind of inconsistent. You know, it presupposes that there was a kind of complex range of beings that gave birth or explained the world, and that so it's not as if it's a total openness to singular knowledge. My perspective would be to seek the commonality of the insights from the Gnostics, which I think are important about individual ideas, and to look and interpret some of these things as metaphorical constructions, and to seek the areas of contiguity with the other ones, which I think they are. The notions of Sophia are very interesting, and some of the idea of an accident and creation is in the Gnostics, but it's also in the Lurianic Kabbalah, and it's also when I was listening to Bernardo Castro talking about his idea of dissociation, the dissociation of consciousness, and it's actually very similar to the Lurianic Kabbalah idea of the light in the individual, but the breaking of the vessels in some way, and the need to recultivate the divine spark. But I'm very interested in Gnosticism, but I'm also aware of some of its weakness, and the weakness is the one that the traditionalists would. Now, this is not to say that, not to agree with it being antithetical towards the. My tendency would be to try and reconcile them. There's certainly a lot of insights, and the insights that came through the mystical movements, Margaret Poiret, and all those female mystics in particular, who emphasized that idea of personal gnosis and tried to integrate it, but they were usually extirpated and excommunicated as well. So the heresy of the free spirit across Europe, there are similarities, and they are consistent with Suhrawardi. They're consistent with my ideas about mysticism, and the need to accommodate, and the institutions get very fearful because they get very comfortable with things being cut and dried, and they attract particular people to the organisation, and those people that they want it to be cut and dried and continue in that vein, and things to be very, very literal, and they don't want anyone coming along and saying, well, actually, I've had this revelation and I don't want to engage in that discourse.
James, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm delighted that we've been able to keep going for nearly 3 hours. I think I'm kind of winding down now, but we've covered a lot of topics. I think I will title this interview something like Mysticism and War. the two polarities that we've been conversing about. Before we close the interview, do you have any final thoughts to share with our viewers?
Well, maybe express my appreciation for the viewers, and I often get kind comments and communications, and I'm very appreciative of the people that take time to listen to us, and I'm extra delighted if they find something useful in it, which they seem to do, and I'm very appreciative of the audience, and for anyone that has listened to us for this length of time, they get a bonus point.
Okay, let me ask you one final question. I'm looking at I presume it's your artwork over your shoulder there, and I'm sure our viewers are going to be curious about it. Is there anything you can say about that piece?
Up in the corner, there is a reference to Muhammad Ali when he fought, I think it was Ken Norton, and it was one of the few fights where he was beaten. It may have been the fight where he broke his jaw. So there's a famous image of him where he's on the ring, he's exhausted, and he said that in some of these fights, it was like death. It was like he nearly died. He said the same thing with Frazier and that. So he had worn a dressing gown into the ring, and he got the dressing gown as a present from Elvis Presley. So in the picture, I have Ali up there, and I'm thinking, and bearing in mind the kind of humorous way that his mind worked, that as well as being exhausted, he'd be thinking, oh, I'm never going to wear that dressing gown again. So he was thinking about Elvis's presence, and there's a pun there so it's Ali thinking about Elvis's presence. So he got a present, and, you have all these stories about Elvis Presley coming back. So in the lines are references to Elvis Presley's profile. So there's superimposed, so you can't necessarily see them at the start, but when you look a bit closer, you'll see references to the profile, because the profile of Elvis was well known. So I thought it was a funny interaction between two great figures over the dressing gown, and the fact of him losing the fight. I'm sure he blamed Elvis, and I don't think he wore it again.
Well, James Tunney, what a pleasure to be with you once again. I'm hopeful that this is still the middle of our interactions. We've completed 30 interviews. I hope we have at least 30 more ahead of us.
Well, I just say to you, Jeffrey, I treasure the communication with you. It's been a great opportunity to speak with you in person, to learn from you, and to speak across the waves, literally. And I think it's been very enriching for me. And I always appreciate the dialogue and the questions and the explorations and the gentlemanly way you do it. And I would also say as well to people that criticize you sometimes for your views, I see some of the comments or people say that the fact that you give someone like me an opportunity to put forward points, and especially when you don't agree with them, is a testament to your bigness. So I think people are very good at pointing fingers, at criticizing people, and other people criticizing you. And I suspect that those people that point the finger maybe are not as big themselves sometimes, so they should be aware that that you do that, and I appreciate that, and that You've demonstrated an openness which you deserve credit for, along with all your other qualities. So I just want to say that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being with me. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us and for lasting this far to the end of this 3-hour interview.